I can fix it. A homeless girl walked up to the billionaire CEO. Then she taught him what he never knew. The rain had stopped days ago, but the sound of it still echoed in Aurelian's mind. Every drop had carried her voice, calm, steady, unforgettable. Broken things deserve another chance. He had tried to push it away, the way he always did with feelings that didn't fit into his schedule. Yet this time it lingered. Her words seemed to have taken residence somewhere between thought and breath. From his penthouse window, the city stretched endlessly, the skyline sharp and alive beneath the morning haze. Yet even this view, once a symbol of victory, felt distant now. The glass between him and the world suddenly seemed thicker. He turned from the window, tightening his tie, forcing his attention toward the day ahead. There were meetings to attend, numbers to review, faces to please. He had lived by this rhythm for years, a man sculpted by purpose, untouched by sentiment. But today focus refused him. He walked through the corridors of his company, where every surface gleamed, every greeting rehearsed. Assistants offered reports, executives spoke in metrics and forecasts, but none of it reached him. The sound of their voices faded into a blur of ambition, the same kind he had built his empire on. Inside the boardroom, a presentation began. Aurelian sat at the head of the table, pen poised, but his mind drifted. He saw her face again, rain-soaked, defiant, unafraid. That single moment under the street lamp had felt more real than all the hours he had spent chasing perfection. Someone at the far end was speaking about quarterly projections. Another mentioned expansion into new markets. Aurelian nodded automatically, his expression unreadable, his mind miles away. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profit or progress. He was thinking about meaning. When the meeting ended, he lingered behind as others filed out. The room emptied, leaving only silence and the faint hum of city noise seeping through the glass. He loosened his tie, sat back and exhaled, a sound that felt foreign in his own throat. On the polished surface before him lay his cufflink, the one Thessaly had promised to fix. It glimmered faintly in the soft light, its clasp still bent, still broken. He stared at it for a long time, not as a possession but as a reminder. It wasn't the metal that troubled him, it was what it represented. He had spent years mastering the art of control, shaping his world until everything obeyed him. Yet here he was, disturbed by a girl with nothing but conviction and hope. He placed the cufflink back in his pocket, almost carefully. That night in the rain had left him with something he couldn't define, a restlessness that refused to fade. By the third morning, Aurelian's rhythm had faltered. The once impeccable precision of his days, the unbroken cycle of calls, meetings, and transactions, now carried small hesitations. He arrived later than usual, his tie slightly askew, his gaze unfocused. The staff exchanged uncertain glances. They weren't used to seeing him like this. Elena, his executive assistant, noticed first. She had worked with him for nearly 6 years, long enough to read what he never said aloud. She stood by the door of his office, tablet in hand, hesitant. "You didn't review the investor briefing, sir," she said softly, not accusatory, merely observing. Aurelian looked up from the window where he had been staring at the city again, as if searching for something in the distance. "I'll get to it," he replied, his voice low, distracted. Elena hesitated. "Are you feeling well?" He turned, studying her face. She was loyal, efficient, a mirror of the life he had built, precise, reliable, distant. And yet, for the first time, he sensed her concern wasn't professional. It was human. "I'm fine," he said, though it sounded more like a question than an answer. She lingered, unsure whether to leave. "You've been quieter. Is something wrong with the board or the merger?" He shook his head. "No, just thinking." It was an odd word for him, thinking, as if he hadn't done enough of that to build an empire. But this was different. He wasn't calculating or planning. He was remembering. Elena gave a small nod and left, though not without a final glance back. When the door closed, Aurelian leaned against his desk, fingers brushing the edge of the cufflink in his pocket. He thought of Thessaly's eyes, clear, unwavering, filled with a kind of strength he couldn't quantify. He had seen ambition, greed, brilliance, and fear in people, but not that. Hers had been something quieter, steadier, conviction without arrogance. For the rest of the day, nothing held his attention. Contracts blurred, numbers lost meaning, conversation slipped through his mind like water through his fingers. That evening, as the city turned golden with sunset, Elena entered once more. "Sir," she said cautiously, "you canceled 3 appointments today. Should I reschedule?" Aurelian looked at her, then at the skyline beyond. "No, leave them open." "Open?" she repeated, surprised. "Yes," he said. "I might need space." The word seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. Space. He had never asked for it before. His life had always been about filling every second, every silence, every pause. Now, it was the silence he sought. When she left, he stood by the window until the city lights began to bloom below. Each light represented a life, thousands of them, moving, breathing, trying. And somewhere among them, perhaps walking with that same worn backpack, was Thessaly. He didn't know why, but he wanted to find her, not out of curiosity nor guilt, but because something inside him whispered that she held an answer he hadn't known he was searching for. The following evening, the rain returned, a light drizzle tracing silver threads across the windows of Aurelian's penthouse. He stood watching, unmoving, until the urge became too strong to ignore. He reached for his coat. No destination, no plan, just motion. The city air greeted him with its cool breath and low hum of life. The sidewalks shimmered faintly under the glow of streetlights. People hurried past, some chasing trains, some chasing time. Aurelian walked among them, unnoticed, just another shadow in a sea of stories. It felt strange to be part of the flow, instead of above it. For years, he had watched this same world from tinted glass and private elevators. A life elevated, detached. But here, at ground level, every sound and scent was sharp. The rustle of newspapers, the rhythm of footsteps, the distant notes of a street musician. He turned down a familiar street, the same one where it had happened, the same street lamp, the same corner. He stopped. For a moment, it was as if time folded back on itself. He could almost see her again, the soaked hood, the steady gaze, the quiet certainty. "I can fix it." The memory struck him like thunder beneath the calm. He looked down at the pavement, at the faint shimmer of water collecting in the cracks, and wondered where she had gone. Had she found shelter? Was she still out there, walking through the same city that had forgotten her name? He walked on, drawn by something he couldn't explain, down alleyways lined with diners, through narrow passages where flickering neon signs reflected off puddles. Every turn carried hope and disappointment. Faces blurred, voices passed, none of them hers. He reached the part of the city most people avoided after dark, where the towers gave way to small shops and weary streets. The contrast was striking. Only a few miles separated this world from his, but it felt like another planet. He saw people huddled in doorways, holding cardboard, blankets, and quiet dignity. They didn't ask for anything, they simply existed, surviving, the way she had said. Aurelian stopped at a corner store and bought 2 cups of coffee. He wasn't sure why, habit perhaps, or hope. Steam curled into the cool air as he waited, watching. Minutes passed. She didn't appear. He left one of the cups on the stone railing near the street lamp where they had first met. The rain had stopped, but the cup trembled slightly from the faint wind. It felt absurd, a billionaire leaving coffee for a stranger who might never return. And yet, as he walked away, he felt something inside him ease, even if just slightly. Maybe, he thought, some gestures aren't meant to be seen. Maybe they're just meant to remind us that we still care. He didn't find her that night, but he didn't stop walking. For the next 3 evenings, Aurelian returned to those same streets, wandering without purpose, following instinct more than reason. It wasn't obsession, it was quiet searching, guided by something deeper than logic. And though she never appeared, he began to notice things he'd never noticed before. The mural of a child's face on a brick wall, the laughter spilling from a bakery closing late, the sound of rain on rooftops. It was as if the world had grown louder, more alive, simply because he'd finally started listening. Walking back toward the center, Aurelian felt the city rearrange itself beneath him. The distance between the high-rise district and the older neighborhoods was not measured in miles but in atmosphere, glass against brick, curated green roofs against stray weeds pushing through cracks. He moved through both worlds the way someone shifts from one language to another, listening for meaning in the cadence of each. Above, the towers of his influence rose sharp and deliberate. Their facades gleamed with the certainty of contracts signed and futures imagined. Neon logos announced brands and ambitions. Lobbies were staffed by people trained to smooth inconvenience away, to keep discomfort politely at bay. In those spaces, time had a smooth, efficient quality. Appointments arrived and left like trains on a schedule. Below, the streets moved differently. Pavement hummed with small transactions. A vendor tucking a jar of pickles into a bag. A teenager juggling school and an after-hours job. A cab driver folding his jacket around his shoulders. Here, rhythm came in improvisation. The quick barter, the whispered apology, the sudden burst of laughter that rose from nowhere and made the night feel less heavy. He stepped from a polished avenue into a lane where the light changed color and the air smelled of frying dough and soap. A child darted past, sneakers slapping wet concrete, chasing a ball. A woman leaned against a shuttered storefront, feeding crumbs to a scruffy dog that had the sure calm of one who knew small mercies. The details arrived all at once. A hand mending a shoelace, a pair of hands sharing a coat, stubborn flowers growing in a chipped pot on a stoop. Aurelian noticed how people moved as if they carried entire histories in their shoulders. He had been so practiced at parsing risk and reward that he had failed to see how much of life was held in these ordinary gestures. He watched a man on a bench hand a blanket to another who was shivering. There was no announcement, no performance, only quiet help. The scene tugged at something that felt like a memory he had misplaced. At the heart of all these contrasts was a kind of honesty. The towers presented curated narratives. The streets offered raw, unvarnished truth. Both were essential elements of the city, yet they asked different things of the people who inhabited them. The penthouse demanded certainty and polish. The streets required improvisation and humility. He moved among delivery cyclists and late-shift nurses, among shuttered hardware stores and neon laundromats, and began to feel the city's texture underfoot. Each neighborhood had its rituals, the call and response of a bakery that opened at dawn, the low music from a pawn shop, the careful stacking of chairs outside a tiny bar. In each ritual, life was doing what life does best, persisting. There was a tenderness here he had never catalogued. A woman rubbing a child's cold hands, a teenager refusing a lifted phone until his friend smiled. These were not headlines, they were the small economies of care that threaded the boroughs together. For someone who had once measured worth in valuations and patents, it was humbling to witness such non-commercial currencies at work. He paused at a crosswalk and watched two people, strangers until a second before, help each other steady a bicycle laden with groceries. They laughed about the imbalance, and the laugh made the moment light. It was a tiny exchange that required nothing but presence. Aurelian realized that these exchanges were repair in miniature, people tending the edges of each other's lives so that the fabric of the neighborhood held. That evening he found himself at the threshold between both worlds, the lighted plaza that led to his building and the narrow alley that opened into the neighborhood where Thessaly had moved so gracefully through struggle. He stood there and realized he no longer felt completely at home in either place. The towers felt too distant, the streets too intimate, yet he had the desire, quiet, persistent, to stay where those two realities met. Something in him had shifted. The authority that once defined him now shared space with curiosity. He no longer wanted only to observe, he wanted to understand. The city, in all its layered complexity, was no longer a backdrop to his ambitions. It was a living network of needs and gifts. As he walked back toward the plaza, he noticed a small repair shop he had previously ignored. Its sign was hand-painted, the paint worn down by years of sun and rain. Inside, someone was soldering a radio, bending over a task that required patience rather than speed. Aurelian lingered by the doorway, watching hands that could take what was broken and coax it into service again. He left without entering, but the image remained, people repairing what others had set aside, bringing value back into play through attention and labor. It was the same impulse Thessaly had embodied beneath the lamp, not grand gestures, but deliberate care. He walked up the steps toward his building, the contrast of glass and brick folding behind him. For the first time since that rainy night, the city's duality did not feel like something to exploit or ignore. It felt like a lesson to be learned, patiently, from the ground up. The night grew longer, yet Aurelian didn't feel ready to return to his penthouse. The streets had begun to empty, puddles reflecting fragments of light from windows above. Each reflection seemed like a story, brief, self-contained, and beautiful in its imperfection. He stood at the corner of 7th and Langdon, where the crosswalk signal flickered from red to green in rhythmic defiance of the rain that had begun again. It was lighter this time, almost gentle. The world felt quieter, as if holding its breath. His phone buzzed. A message from his assistant, tomorrow's investor call confirmed. "Do you need me to move the press meeting?" Aurelian read the message but didn't reply. His fingers hovered above the keyboard before he finally slid the device into his coat pocket. He didn't want to think about investors, reports, or any of it. Not now. The noise of business suddenly felt small compared to the conversation still echoing in his mind, her words like a pulse. Broken things deserve another chance. He looked up again, watching a cab glide through the mist, its headlights catching 1,000 raindrops mid-air. The sound of the engine, the hush of wheels through water, it all blended into something soothing, something real. For years his focus had been upward, toward the skyline, toward growth, toward more. But lately his thoughts had been moving downward, back to the ground where things cracked, chipped, and carried marks of use. There was a strange grace in the imperfect, he realized. Maybe that was what she had meant all along. As he leaned against a lamppost, Aurelian whispered quietly, "What are you trying to teach me, Thessaly?" The words left his mouth before he realized he'd said them aloud. A couple passing by gave him a curious glance but kept walking. He smiled faintly at himself. He didn't know whether he was looking for her or for what she represented. Maybe it wasn't about finding her at all. Maybe it was about what her presence had revealed, a gap in his own heart that he'd never taken the time to mend. A truck passed, splashing a small wave toward the curb. The droplets hit his shoes, but he didn't move back. He stayed rooted there, feeling the chill seep through, feeling alive. The city around him hummed. Delivery vans, late buses, a few voices carried through open windows. And as he watched, Aurelian began to notice something remarkable. People repairing life in real time. A woman crouched to pick up a box that had fallen from a courier's bike. A young man wrapped his jacket around a stray cat hiding under an awning. These were fleeting acts, almost invisible, but they stitched the city together in quiet ways no architecture ever could. Aurelian breathed out, the fog of his breath rising into the cool air. For the first time in a long time, his thoughts weren't about deals or deadlines. They were about connection, the kind that couldn't be bought or traded. He tilted his head toward the sky and felt the drizzle on his face. A faint smile formed. Maybe broken things really do deserve another chance, he murmured. Then, almost as if remembering an old habit, he straightened his coat, took one step toward the direction of his building, and then stopped again. He looked once more at the wet pavement, at the world moving in its quiet resilience, and decided something. Tomorrow, he would walk again. Not out of restlessness, but intention. He didn't have a plan or destination, only a pull, one that told him that somewhere out there beyond the glow of towers and the hum of engines, an answer was waiting to be found. As he turned back toward the city's heart, a voice rose within him. Not Thessaly's this time, but his own, gentler and sure. Keep searching, not for her, for understanding. The night folded around him soft and cool. The city, in all its contradiction, no longer felt like something he merely owned a piece of. It felt like something that was quietly shaping him. Before the camera of your mind fades from that moment, let me speak directly to you, listener. If you've ever met someone who made you question what really matters, hit like and stay with us. This one's for you. Because sometimes the people who seem to cross our paths by accident aren't passing through at all. They're mirrors, showing us what we've been too busy to see, or really and didn't know it yet. But this restlessness wasn't just a phase, it was the beginning of a change that no amount of money could have purchased. The rain thickened. He lifted his collar and began walking again, footsteps steady, moving not with purpose, but with faith that the road ahead would tell him where to go next. 2 days later, Aurelian found himself walking once more through the lower district, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He told himself he was simply taking the long route back to the office, stretching his legs before another evening of meetings. But deep down, he knew he was looking, not for a person perhaps, but for clarity. The city had changed with the hour. Morning light spilled unevenly across the streets, bouncing off windows streaked with rain from the night before. Food carts steamed on corners. The scent of roasted coffee mingled with exhaust, and somewhere a radio crackled with an old tune that sounded oddly hopeful. Aurelian slowed as he passed a small brick building near the intersection of Pearl and Grant. The faded sign above the door read, Haven House Community Shelter. A cluster of children sat on the steps, bundled in mismatched coats, their laughter carrying above the hum of the city. He might have kept walking, except one voice rose above the rest, calm, focused, almost musical in its patience. If you twist the wire too tight, it breaks, but if you leave it loose, it won't hold the current. Balance. That's the secret. The voice was unmistakable. Aurelian stopped. He turned toward the sound. There she was, Thessaly. She sat cross-legged beside a young boy, both of them hunched over an old, dented radio. Her jacket was still the same, worn but neat, and her hair was tied back with a red ribbon that seemed out of place yet somehow perfect. Her hands moved with care as she adjusted the wires, her expression calm but intent. The boy watched her with wide eyes. "Will it work again?" he asked. She smiled, a quiet curve of reassurance. "Everything can work again. It just takes patience." Something inside Aurelian stilled. He had seen engineers rebuild drones, programmers resurrect entire systems. But there was something in the way she said it, the way she believed it, that made him feel as though she was talking about more than circuits and wires. He stood there longer than he intended, watching her speak, watching her teach, watching her bring something broken back to life. When the radio finally sputtered to sound, the children cheered. Thessaly laughed softly, a sound like warmth cutting through cold. Aurelian stepped closer. "I didn't know you fixed radios too," he said. Thessaly turned her head slowly. her eyes widening in recognition before narrowing slightly, cautious but not unkind. "You again," she said. "Did your cufflinks survive?" He smiled faintly. "It did. Still bent, though. I kept it that way." Her gaze softened for a moment. "A reminder? Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I just didn't want to throw it away." Thessaly tilted her head, studying him for a heartbeat. "That's rare for someone like you. Someone like me? People who live high enough to forget what the ground feels like." Aurelian almost laughed, not because she was wrong, but because she said it so plainly. There was no bitterness in her tone, just observation. He nodded. "Fair. Maybe that's why I'm here." She returned her attention to the boy, now beaming at the humming radio. "Then maybe you're closer to the ground than you think." For a while they stood together in quiet. The city noise faded behind them, replaced by the static and music drifting from the radio. Aurelian felt an odd sense of calm, as though the noise inside him had found its counterpoint in the simplicity of this place. He watched her hand the radio to the child, her movements unhurried, her smile real. "Go share it," she said softly. "Good things aren't meant to be kept." The boy ran off, shouting his thanks. Aurelian's voice came low. "You always fix what's broken?" Thessaly turned to him, the corner of her mouth lifting. "I try. But sometimes things don't need fixing. They just need to be understood." Her words lingered between them, heavy with meaning neither of them could name. Aurelian's eyes followed Thessaly as she stood, brushing imaginary dust from her jacket. She wasn't just fixing the radio, she was commanding the space around her with a quiet authority, a confidence unshaken by circumstance. He realized that day, watching her, that strength wasn't always loud. It didn't need a title, a corner office, or a crowd of admirers. Sometimes it came in the patient lift of hands, the steadiness in the gaze, the refusal to bow to life's difficulties. The boy who had received the repaired radio ran off, leaving a trail of laughter behind. Thessaly tucked the wires into a small bag and adjusted her backpack. She looked at Aurelian as if weighing whether he belonged in this moment. "You follow me around now?" she asked, tone light but cautious. "Not intentionally," he admitted. I wanted to see if you were okay. That's all." Her eyes narrowed slightly, skeptical yet amused. "I'm always okay." Aurelian raised an eyebrow. "Always?" "Yes," she said, voice firm. "Being okay isn't about comfort. It's about choice. I choose to keep going. Every day." He was struck by the simplicity of it. He had spent years building safety nets, calculating outcomes, predicting risks, and yet here was someone who survived on resolve alone. She didn't wait for someone else to make things right. She acted. "You seem proud of that," he said. She smiled faintly, not boastful, just present. "I don't have the luxury to be anything else. Pride isn't about ego, it's about knowing your value when no one else sees it." Aurelian paused, letting the words sink in. His world had always measured value in numbers, deals, and recognition. Here, value was intrinsic. It required no certificate, no applause, no acknowledgement. "You've got a moral compass," he said, hesitating to give voice to what he felt. Thessaly's gaze met his, steady and unwavering. "A compass doesn't tell you where to go. It tells you how to move when the path is unclear. You need more than money to navigate life, Mr. Cross. More than plans, more than walls." Aurelian swallowed. He had spent decades erecting walls, around his heart, around his empire, around the parts of himself that felt too fragile to expose. And now, standing here, he wondered if those walls had only kept him from understanding something essential. "You're not like anyone I've met," he admitted quietly. "And you're not like anyone I'd expect to be watching over a group of kids fixing a radio," she replied, tilting her head, a playful glint in her eyes. He smiled faintly, the tension in his chest easing just enough to allow curiosity. "You teach them more than just radios, don't you?" "Maybe," she said. "Maybe I teach them that life isn't about what you get, but how you care." That's the lesson worth remembering. Her words, simple as they were, struck deeper than any speech, any lecture, or any boardroom strategy he had ever absorbed. For the first time, Aurelian felt as though he were standing in a space where results didn't matter, only presence. She zipped her backpack, adjusted the straps, and turned to him fully. "I don't ask for help," she said, almost as a statement of principle, "but I don't refuse it if it comes in the right way." He nodded slowly, understanding the subtle distinction. Help, when offered as pity, would have been meaningless to her, but offered with respect, attention, and integrity, it could be accepted. That idea, simple, nuanced, began to unravel the rigid structures he had built around himself. As they walked together along the narrow street bordering the shelter, Aurelian realized he wanted to understand her world, not change it, not yet. Not by giving her money or status. He wanted to see through her eyes, to witness the principles that guided her through adversity with such quiet confidence. The city hummed around them. Vendors called their closing announcements. Children's laughter floated from alleyways, and the faint sound of music drifted from an open window. And amidst it all, Thessaly moved with calm authority, unhurried, unafraid, entirely present. Aurelian realized he had spent decades pursuing control over the world, but she had mastered the art of control over herself. That difference, subtle yet profound, captivated him more than any boardroom triumph ever could. For the first time since the rainy night, he felt an awareness of what it meant to truly observe another person. To see someone not as an object of curiosity, but as a fully realized being navigating a life that demanded resilience and courage. And in that moment, he understood something crucial. Strength and dignity weren't measured by possessions or accolades. They were measured by persistence, grace under pressure, and the refusal to surrender one's values, even when the world seemed indifferent. Aurelian walked beside her in silence, letting the realization settle. He wasn't here to fix her, as he had once assumed. He was here to understand, to witness, to learn. And that, he thought, might be the hardest lesson of all. They walked a short distance from the shelter, side by side, the faint hum of the city surrounding them. Aurelian hesitated before speaking, searching for the right words. He knew that money, gestures, or grand offers would not reach her, not this time. I wanted to offer something," he began carefully. Thessaly glanced at him, curiosity tempered by caution. "Something?" "Yes," he said, his voice measured, "but not in the way I usually give. Not money, not power, not influence. I want to help only if you allow it on your terms." She arched an eyebrow, the corner of her mouth twitching. "Terms?" He nodded. "I want to support what matters to you, in the way you define it. I've realized that no amount of wealth can fix everything. Some things need understanding, attention, guidance. I can give that if you'll let me." Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if testing whether he truly meant it. Then she smiled faintly. "That's different." "Yes," he admitted. "I want to learn from you, not impose on you. I want to help the way you see fit, not the way I see fit." She paused, considering him. "You're serious?" "Completely," he said. "I've been trying to control too much for too long. Maybe now it's time I stop and listen." Thessaly's gaze softened. She didn't take the offer immediately. She never did. Instead, she studied him, gauging whether he was here out of curiosity, guilt, or genuine intent. After a long pause, she finally nodded. "Then the first step," she said, "is to respect what I care about most. And that means you don't make decisions for me. You watch, you learn, you assist when asked. Nothing more." Aurelian's shoulders relaxed. "I can do that." Her eye shifted to a small community garden tucked between two buildings. Some of the children from the shelter tended it, watering plants, clearing debris, and laughing as they argued over who got to prune the roses. "Start here," she said. "Help them keep this garden alive. Then, maybe we can see where else help is needed." He nodded, understanding the subtle lesson. She wasn't testing his generosity, she was teaching him patience, humility, and the value of presence over possession. As they approached the garden, a little boy ran to Thessaly, holding a broken toy car. "Can you fix it?" he asked. She knelt immediately, inspecting the wheels. "We'll see. It's not about whether it's perfect, it's about whether it can keep moving." Aurelian watched her hands work, noting her patience, her focus, and her ability to convey reassurance without words. Every child who approached her felt seen, valued, understood. He stepped closer, kneeling to assist. It wasn't instinct for him, it felt foreign to work with his hands rather than issuing commands. Yet he followed her instructions carefully, passing tools, holding pieces steady, learning the rhythm of repair as she directed. Hours passed in quiet cooperation. For Aurelian, it was the first time he had ever experienced effort without expectation. Effort simply to restore, to support, to nurture. The children's laughter filled the spaces between words, and for the first time in years he felt the kind of connection that wasn't measured in contracts or returns. At one point, Thessaly looked up at him and smiled. "You're learning quickly." "I'm trying," he admitted. "No, you're more than trying," she said softly. "You're present. That's rare." He allowed himself a small smile. Presence. He had spent decades chasing results, forgetting that sometimes the most profound impact comes from simply being there. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the garden, Thessaly stood and adjusted her backpack. "I have to check on a few more things before evening, but thank you for today. Really." Aurelian watched her, feeling the pull of something deeper than admiration. "I should be thanking you," he said. "You're teaching me more than I expected." She glanced at him, eyes steady. "Good, that's the point." And with that, she walked away, leaving him surrounded by tools, plants, and the quiet realization that helping differently, without dominance, without control, was a lesson he would carry far longer than any business strategy. As the afternoon sun began to fade, painting the street in muted gold, Aurelian followed Thessaly through a narrow path beside the shelter. She moved with calm confidence, her pace unhurried, her eyes attentive to the city around them. He wanted to speak, but words felt heavy, as if they might disrupt the quiet dignity she carried. Finally, he found the courage to ask, "Thessaly, may I ask you something? I want to understand you," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Not your circumstances, but your story. How you came to be here, how you carry yourself through it all." She stopped walking and turned fully toward him, her eyes meeting his. There was no hesitation in her gaze, only a measured weight. "Some stories aren't meant to be fully shared," she said softly, "but I can give you glimpses, enough to understand, not enough to possess." Aurelian nodded, aware of the subtle lesson. "I don't want to possess it. I want to listen. That's all." She considered him for a moment, then began. "I've been homeless for as long as I can remember. Not because I didn't try, because life demanded I keep moving, keep surviving. Family, friends, everything I relied on disappeared at different times, some through circumstance, some by choice. And yet here I am, still moving, still learning." He listened silently, struck by the calm strength behind her words. She spoke not with anger nor bitterness nor self-pity. She spoke with precision, like someone who had walked through storms and emerged understanding that survival didn't require surrendering one's values. "You're resilient," he said finally. "Resilient isn't the right word," she corrected. "Resilient implies endurance without direction. I don't just endure, I observe, I decide, I act. Resilience alone is passive, what I practice is active." Aurelian felt a quiet humility settle over him. Here was someone who had faced far more than he ever had, and yet she was teaching him, a billionaire accustomed to commanding every aspect of his world, how to truly navigate life. She walked again, gesturing toward a small alleyway where a few discarded radios and old electronics were arranged for repair. "I fix what I can, because broken things deserve attention," she said. Not everyone understands that. Not everyone tries. But I do. That's the measure of my days. He followed, noticing how every movement, every glance, every word carried intention. I want to help, he said. Not just today, but in a way that matters to you. Thessaly looked at him, the corner of her mouth lifting faintly. Help in the right way, yes, but help isn't always about giving. Sometimes it's about presence. Sometimes it's about witnessing. Sometimes it's about letting someone see that they're not invisible. Her words struck him deeply. For all his wealth, all his influence, he had never considered the power of simple acknowledgement. He had built empires, yet had failed to truly witness lives around him. She paused beside a weathered bench. I don't speak much of my past because it doesn't define me, but it teaches me. Every day, I carry lessons from every struggle, every loss. I let them guide me without allowing them to imprison me. Aurelian stayed quiet, absorbing her philosophy. Her dignity, her quiet moral compass, and her refusal to be diminished by circumstance challenged everything he believed about success, strength, and worth. You have a moral clarity I've never encountered, he admitted. It's humbling. She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach all the way to her eyes. I've had to see clearly because the world didn't always show me truth. When everything is stripped away, when you have nothing but yourself, clarity becomes necessary. I can't let distraction, despair, or pretense rule my choices. That's how I survive and in my own way thrive. He exhaled softly, realizing that her resilience was intertwined with perspective. It wasn't just survival, it was intentional living, guided by values rather than circumstances. For a moment they stood together in silence, the city's noise a muted hum in the background. Aurelian felt the enormity of what he was learning, that wealth and influence had never been necessary to effect meaningful change. Perspective, intention, and integrity had far greater power. I think I understand a little more now, he said finally, but I also know I still have much to learn. She inclined her head. And that's the point. Understanding is never complete. Life is a teacher, not a possession. Aurelian realized in that quiet exchange that he had encountered someone who challenged the very framework of his existence. Thessaly had shared just enough, not her whole story, not every detail, but the fragments were enough to illuminate her strength, her humility, and her moral compass. And for the first time in a long time, he felt both the weight and the privilege of being a listener. As the afternoon began to fade into evening, the air took on a softer hue. Shadows stretched long across the alleyways, and the city's hum shifted from daytime bustle to the quiet rhythm of evening routines. Aurelian walked beside Thessaly, feeling an unfamiliar steadiness in his steps. You know, he began, careful. I've spent my life thinking I could control everything. Projects, companies, outcomes, even people. And yet, standing here, I feel like I've learned nothing until now. Thessaly glanced at him, a faint smile touching her lips. You've been too busy trying to fix the world around you, rather than seeing what's right in front of you. He nodded, letting the words sink in. She had a way of speaking that made insight feel effortless, not forced, not pedantic, but alive. He realized that he had arrived at an understanding he had never achieved through conferences, contracts, or accolades. I want to help, he said softly, almost as if repeating a mantra. Not just today, not just with what I can offer. I want to understand, to be present, if you'll allow it. Thessaly looked at him for a long moment. Her gaze was steady, yet there was a glint of amusement in it, the subtle acknowledgement of his sincerity. You've offered more than money or influence, she said. That's rare. That's worth paying attention to. A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable but contemplative. They walked slowly, side by side, through a quiet street lined with closed shops and faintly glowing windows. The city seemed different now, quieter yet full of potential, much like the understanding that was settling between them. "You're not here to fix me," she said finally, almost as a confirmation. "You're here to see what matters." "I think I'm starting to," he admitted. "And it's harder than I expected." "Good," she replied simply. "Growth is never easy." He smiled faintly, realizing that her words extended beyond the present moment. They applied not just to him, but to anyone who believed in control over life instead of engagement with it. Aurelian felt a subtle shift within himself, the first movement of something he had long denied: humility. He had always measured success in achievement, influence, and acquisition. But standing here, beside someone who had nothing yet carried everything she valued, he felt the weight of a different kind of measure: integrity, persistence, and attentiveness. The sun dipped lower and the shadows grew longer, stretching across the streets like gentle reminders. Thessaly paused at the edge of the alley, adjusting her backpack. "I have to check on a few more things before the evening," she said. "But thank you for today, truly." "I should be thanking you," he said. "You've shown me things I've never noticed in all my years." She inclined her head slightly, her expression softening. "Sometimes it's the quiet lessons that matter most. Remember that." As she turned to leave, Aurelian realized he wanted more than a fleeting encounter. He didn't yet know how, or when, or if he would see her again, but he knew he would carry today's lessons with him, letting them guide choices he had never considered. The streets hummed with ordinary life, a bicycle bell ringing, distant laughter, the faint scent of food from a nearby cart. Aurelian stood for a moment, taking it all in. He felt lighter, yet more anchored than he had in years. Something essential had shifted within him, a recognition that not everything could be built, bought, or planned. Some things could only be acknowledged, understood, and tended to with patience. Thessaly's presence had left its mark, subtle but indelible. He understood now that influence and wealth could open doors, but understanding and engagement could open hearts. That insight, fragile, tentative, but true, was a gift he hadn't anticipated receiving. He watched her disappear down a narrow street, the fading light catching her silhouette. And as he turned to head back toward the main avenue, he felt a quiet determination settle over him. This was not the end of their story, not by far. Little did he know, this encounter was only the beginning, the first of many lessons the streets and Thessaly would offer. Lessons about patience, presence, and the quiet power of choosing to see what others overlook. Before the city swallowed her silhouette completely, Aurelian whispered to himself, "I'll find the right way to help. I'll learn. I won't forget." And in that moment, the city around him didn't feel like a place to conquer or control. It felt like a living classroom, and Thessaly, in her quiet strength, had become its most remarkable teacher. A few days after the second encounter, Aurelian found himself considering a different kind of approach. He had learned patience, humility, and the value of presence alongside Thessaly, and now he wanted to take the next step, not as a benefactor, not as a wealthy outsider, but as someone seeking genuine connection. He chose a small cafe tucked between two mid-rise buildings, a place neither lavish nor crowded. Warm light spilled through its windows, blending with the scent of roasted coffee beans and fresh pastries. It was neutral territory, a place where she could feel neither patronized nor observed, a place where conversation could happen on equal footing. When Thessaly arrived, she wore a simple coat and carried a canvas tote bag. Her hair had dried from the previous drizzle, and her eyes reflected cautious curiosity. She greeted him with a nod rather than a smile, the same careful vigilance he had observed in their earlier interactions. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, gesturing toward an empty table near the window. She slid into the chair across from him. "I said I'd consider your presence, not your coffee," she teased lightly, though her eyes betrayed no real amusement, only measured observation. Aurelian chuckled. Fair enough. Then we'll skip the formalities. Let's just talk. As they settled in, he noticed the contrast between them, not just in appearance but in presence. He, accustomed to tailored suits and meticulously organized schedules, and she accustomed to a life that demanded adaptability, improvisation, and patience with imperfection. Yet here they were, aligned by curiosity rather than circumstance. The waiter arrived and they ordered drinks, nothing extravagant, just something warm. While they waited, Aurelian began, I wanted to understand you better. Not from a distance, not from assumptions, but by listening. I hope this doesn't feel like charity. Thessaly's gaze met his, unflinching. It doesn't, she said. But the fact that you're aware of how it could feel is encouraging. Most people never even consider it. He nodded, grateful for her acknowledgement. It wasn't admiration he sought, it was connection. Their drinks arrived, and with the steam rising between them, Aurelian felt the unusual weight of silence. It was not uncomfortable, it was reflective, allowing them to measure the space between their worlds and decide how much to bridge. Aurelian stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, the warmth seeping through the ceramic cup, grounding him in a way that the polished walls of his penthouse never had. He studied Thessaly, noticing how her posture radiated a calm alertness, how her eyes carried the weight of experience without bitterness. I've spent my life building things, he began, choosing his words carefully. Companies, investments, properties, everything is measurable, profitable, tangible. It's the way I've always understood value. Thessaly tilted her head, listening but not interrupting. Her expression was neutral, yet it held an almost invisible challenge, as if questioning whether he truly understood what he was saying.
I know it sounds shallow when I say it aloud, he continued, but it's what I know. Control, predictability, assurance.
She leaned forward slightly, hands wrapped around her own cup. Assurance, she echoed, testing the word. And yet, all the assurance in the world can't guarantee understanding, happiness, or even meaningful connections. You can own everything and still be empty. Aurelian paused, struck by the accuracy of her words. He had experienced the hollow victories, the accolades that felt like echoes, and the constant pulse of loneliness that wealth had never filled. You speak as if meaning is separate from success, he said cautiously. I've never understood how people find it without what I have. Thessaly's lips curved faintly. Meaning isn't about what you have. It's about what you do with what you notice, with what's given to you, with what others overlook. $100 million can't buy insight, presence, or integrity. And those are what truly matter. Her words hit him with an unexpected intensity. He had always assumed that wealth equated influence and satisfaction. Yet here she was, surviving in a world he never imagined, asserting a moral clarity he had rarely encountered. You make it sound so simple, he said, though his voice lacked certainty. Simple? She asked, raising a brow. Perhaps, but simple doesn't mean easy. Living by principle, choosing courage over comfort, noticing what others ignore, that's not easy. That's why it's rare. That's why it matters. Aurelian stared at her, realizing that for the first time in decades he was genuinely challenged. Not by a competitor, not by a boardroom rival, but by someone who carried nothing in material terms, yet possessed a richness of perspective he had never known. You're saying all my control, all my money doesn't mean anything? He asked quietly. Not nothing, she corrected, but it's incomplete. You've built walls, Aurelian, strong walls. And those walls protect, but they also isolate. They shield you from understanding what truly matters, from seeing the lives around you, from recognizing what can't be measured. The words resonated within him, yet he struggled to respond. Pride had always been a silent companion, guiding decisions and masking vulnerability. Now, her insight peeled away that defense, leaving him exposed, reflective, and eager to comprehend. He leaned back slightly, tracing the rim of his cup with his fingers. Then how do I change that? He asked, his voice quieter than usual. How do I start? Thessaly's gaze softened, but her posture remained grounded. You start by noticing, not dictating, not assuming you know the answer. Listen, observe, be present, and sometimes just let things be. Let them teach you, rather than trying to control them. Aurelian exhaled, feeling the weight of years of certainty slowly lifting. Her clarity was not confrontational. It was illuminating. And the contrast between his life and hers, comfort versus courage, abundance versus resilience, began to sketch a new perspective he had never considered. You make it sound achievable, he admitted, the words tasting strange but honest. It's achievable, she said simply. But only if you are willing to let go of what you think is essential and pay attention to what actually is. For a long moment they sat in quiet reflection, the hum of the cafe around them providing a soft backdrop to their thoughts. Aurelian realized that their worlds, so different, so separated by circumstance, could intersect not through wealth, but through presence, understanding, and shared insight. And for the first time he felt that connection might be possible. Fragile, tentative, but real. Aurelian leaned back in his chair, letting the warmth of the coffee seep into his palms. His mind raced, caught between the safety of familiarity and the challenge Thessaly presented. Her world was raw, unpredictable, demanding courage at every turn. His world was ordered, controlled, comfortable. You make bravery sound ordinary, he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the steam curling above his cup. But I've spent my life avoiding risk, calculating outcomes, protecting myself. Thessaly's eyes met his, calm yet firm. Comfort is seductive, Aurelian. It lulls you into thinking safety is equivalent to strength. But courage isn't about avoiding discomfort. It's about acting, despite it, choosing integrity, honesty, and presence even when it costs you, even when it's inconvenient. He considered her words, feeling the subtle weight behind each one. He had always measured success in predictability and control, yet here was someone whose entire existence demanded daily courage, whose choices were deliberate, principled, and guided by a compass he had never learned to follow. You make it sound necessary, he said slowly. It is necessary, she replied. Not because the world demands it of you, but because you demand it of yourself. Living cautiously may preserve comfort, but it doesn't preserve character. It doesn't preserve meaning. Aurelian felt a flicker of discomfort, the kind that accompanies recognition of one's own shortcomings. He had accumulated comfort, yes, yet he had neglected understanding, connection, and presence. The irony of his position wasn't lost on him, surrounded by abundance, yet starved for insight and meaningful human exchange. You talk about choice, he said, leaning forward, voice quieter now. But sometimes choosing courage seems impossible. Thessaly tilted her head. Impossible only exists when you define it as such. Courage doesn't appear in grand gestures. It appears in small, consistent acts. Showing up when it's easier not to. Speaking truth when silence is simpler. Acknowledging others when ignorance would suffice. That's courage. Her words resonated with a force that surprised him. He had built empires, made decisions with thousands relying on them, yet she was redefining what it meant to be courageous, and in doing so, challenging him to reconsider his own understanding of worth and value. He took a slow sip of coffee, the liquid grounding him as he absorbed her perspective. So, you're saying comfort is a kind of imprisonment? Only if you let it define you, she replied. Comfort can preserve, yes, but it can also blind. It can lull you into believing that nothing else matters when the world is full of lessons waiting to be learned. A silence fell between them, a quiet tension marked by reflection rather than conflict. In that pause, Aurelian felt the delicate push and pull of their differences, his comfort clashing with her courage, his certainty meeting her principles. Yet in the friction, an unspoken warmth began to emerge. I think "I understand why I feel restless lately," he admitted. "Why I can't stop thinking about our last encounters. It's as if I've been asleep, and suddenly I've opened my eyes. And it's unsettling, but necessary." Thessaly's expression softened slightly. "Recognition is the first step, but seeing is only part of it. You must act on what you notice, even in small ways." He nodded, aware that this conversation had already shifted something inside him. The push of her truth challenged him. The pull of her perspective invited introspection. For the first time in years, he felt the complexity of human connection, uncomfortable, illuminating, and profoundly alive. And amidst the tension, a subtle warmth began to take root. He realized that engagement with her world didn't diminish his own. It enriched it. Their differences, instead of dividing them, were revealing new possibilities for understanding, growth, and authentic interaction. As the cafe's lights dimmed with the approaching evening, Aurelian felt a quiet acknowledgement. Comfort could no longer be his sole guide. Courage, presence, and attentiveness, the principles Thessaly embodied, were the lessons he needed to embrace. After their conversation, Aurelian walked the streets alone for a while, letting the city's rhythm settle around him. The cafe's warmth had faded, leaving him with only the echo of Thessaly's words. Her insistence on courage over comfort, presence over possession, had left an imprint he couldn't ignore. He passed familiar landmarks, gleaming towers, polished storefronts, luxury cars parked along pristine sidewalks, yet none of it offered the same satisfaction it once had. Everything felt smaller, flatter, measured against the weight of the insight she had shared. He realized that his achievements, impressive as they were, lacked the dimension of meaning he had glimpsed in her world. Sitting briefly on a quiet bench, he allowed himself to reflect. He had spent decades accumulating, constructing, controlling, and yet here he was, captivated not by wealth or influence, but by a perspective that demanded attention, empathy, and deliberate action. Thessaly's life, though materially lean, possessed richness he had never encountered. Her courage and clarity illuminated what had been missing in his own existence. He thought about the children she had guided at the shelter, the patience in her hands as she repaired broken toys, the way she had engaged him without seeking anything in return. It was more than moral guidance. It was an active demonstration of living intentionally, of investing in small but significant human connections. For the first time, he considered the possibility that his world and hers could intersect meaningfully. Wealth and comfort were tools, he realized, but only if tempered with understanding, humility, and willingness to listen. Perhaps the bridge between their worlds wasn't built through grand gestures, but through thoughtful, consistent engagement. He recalled her insistence that courage manifests in small, deliberate acts. Each choice, each moment of attentiveness, could build something far more enduring than any empire he had created. And it dawned on him, the true measure of influence was not the scale of power wielded, but the depth of understanding offered and received. Aurelian closed his eyes briefly, envisioning the quiet life Thessaly led, not for pity, not for survival alone, but for principle and action. He understood that he had been gifted a lens into a world he had never explored, one that demanded integrity, empathy, and subtle yet profound bravery. The contrast between their realities, once stark and intimidating, now seemed like an invitation, an opportunity to integrate the courage, patience, and presence she exemplified into his own life. He resolved, silently, to observe first, to act second, to meet her world on its terms rather than imposing his own. Walking back toward his penthouse, Aurelian noticed nuances in the streets he had never seen before. A mural hidden in an alley, a group of children sharing laughter with improvised toys, an elderly man tending a small garden patch between buildings. Each instance was fleeting, yet each carried a lesson in attention, care, and human presence. Thessaly had taught him to see these details, to notice life in ways he had overlooked for years. As night settled over the city, he felt a quiet determination not to control, not to possess, not to impose, but to engage meaningfully where it mattered. The two worlds he inhabited, hers and his, need not collide destructively. Instead, they could coexist, intersect, and illuminate possibilities he had never considered. And in that reflection, he understood the subtle, transformative power of her influence. Not through confrontation, not through persuasion, but through presence, courage, and unwavering moral clarity. By the time Aurelian returned to the cafe to see Thessaly one last time that afternoon, the golden light of late evening had softened into a muted amber glow. The city outside hummed with quiet activity, distant laughter, and the faint hum of traffic. The space between them carried a different kind of tension now. Less confrontation, more curiosity, less challenge, more recognition. Thessaly sat at a corner table, her canvas tote beside her, fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She looked up as he approached, eyes steady, measuring. A moment passed where neither spoke, yet the silence was meaningful rather than empty. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," Aurelian began carefully. "About courage, presence, and noticing what matters. And I realize how little I've truly seen." She offered a subtle nod, acknowledging his admission without comment. Her posture remained strong yet unguarded, a quiet invitation for him to continue. "I've spent so much time protecting comfort, accumulating control, and I never noticed how much that cost me," he admitted. "Not in money, not in influence, but in understanding, in connection. In moments like these," Thessaly's gaze softened just enough for a hint of warmth to appear. "Recognition is the first step," she said gently, "but it's not enough. Observation without action is empty. You've noticed, yes. Now it's about how you carry that awareness." He felt a strange weight of humility, an unfamiliar but welcome feeling. Here, in this neutral space, the walls he had built around himself seemed to dissolve slightly, leaving room for reflection, dialogue, and perhaps change. "Do you ever wonder," he asked quietly, "if people from different worlds can truly understand each other?" She considered the question, letting it hang between them. "Understanding is never complete," she said finally. "But that doesn't mean it's impossible. It's possible when both sides listen, observe, and act with intention. It's imperfect, yes, but worth striving for." Aurelian nodded, absorbing the lesson. The subtle tension between them, born of their divergent experiences, had shifted. It was no longer a barrier, it was a bridge, tentative but promising. He noticed small things he hadn't before, the way her eyes softened when she spoke of her small acts of care, the measured way she communicated without seeking praise, the quiet dignity that had never demanded acknowledgement yet earned it effortlessly. Each detail illuminated what had been missing in his own life: patience, observation, and moral clarity. "Thank you," he said finally, the words simple but genuine. "Not for the conversation alone, but for showing me what I haven't been seeing." She offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "It's not about me. It's about what you choose to notice, Aurelian, and how you act on it." He felt the weight of her presence settle into him, like a quiet but insistent current, guiding him toward reflection and action. There was warmth now, subtle yet undeniable, threading through the conversation, a recognition of shared humanity despite differences in circumstance, a connection formed not by convenience but by intentional engagement. As they stood to leave, Thessaly adjusted her tote bag and glanced at him. "Remember, awareness is only meaningful when it leads to change. Observe, act, and care. That's the way forward." Aurelian watched her walk toward the street, her figure moving with the same steady resilience he had observed before. And as she disappeared into the evening, he realized that this encounter, like the first, like the second, was not an ending. It was a beginning, a subtle foreshadowing of lessons to come, of paths he would walk, and choices he would make with intention rather than habit. The city lights flickered on, bathing the street in soft illumination. He felt a quiet anticipation, a recognition that the coming days would challenge him, guide him, and teach him more than any boardroom, contract, or accolade ever could. The following afternoon, Aurelian found himself in a quiet corner of a small park. A gentle breeze carried the faint scent of wet earth and distant coffee shops. Thessaly arrived shortly after, her movements deliberate but unhurried, as if she measured each step by intention rather than routine. They settled on a worn wooden bench, the city noise softened to a background murmur. Aurelian observed her carefully, sensing that today's conversation would carry a weight different from their previous discussions. "I haven't shared much about myself," Thessaly began softly, her eyes tracing a crack in the pavement. "But I think it's time." He nodded, inviting her to continue without pressure. "When I was younger," she said, voice calm but deliberate, "I lost almost everything, my home, my family, my sense of certainty. I didn't have much to begin with, but I had dreams, plans, and hope. And when those were taken away, I realized that hope was all I truly owned." Aurelian listened intently, struck by the vulnerability in her tone, tempered by strength. Unlike the people in his usual world, who often demanded attention or sympathy, she conveyed her story with quiet resilience, expecting nothing in return. "I remember the first night I had nowhere to go," she continued. "I sat under a lamppost, clutching a backpack that had become my entire world, and I told myself even then, I can endure this. I can rebuild. I will not be discarded because of circumstances. I will not let the world define my worth." Her words hung in the air, heavier than any speech he had heard in a boardroom, more piercing than any negotiation he had conducted. They weren't dramatic in a conventional sense. There were no embellished emotions, no pleas, just raw, unshakable determination. Aurelian felt a mix of admiration and shame, admiration for her courage, and shame for how easily he had overlooked resilience in others, substituting power and efficiency for empathy and understanding. "Hope," she said finally, "isn't loud. It doesn't need an audience. It survives quietly, insisting on life even when everything else has been taken away." Aurelian's chest tightened. For the first time, he understood that the essence of survival, of purpose, wasn't in accumulation or perfection. It was in persistence, presence, and the decision to value what others might discard. Thessaly leaned back slightly, her gaze distant yet grounded. The afternoon sun streamed through the trees, casting gentle shadows across the park. She paused before speaking, as if choosing the right cadence for words that carried more than mere description. "Do you remember the cufflink?" she asked, her voice steady. Aurelian nodded, recalling the rainy night, the clink of metal, and her simple, unwavering words. "I can fix it." She smiled faintly. "I wasn't just talking about a cufflink. I meant it for everything, the broken, the discarded, the overlooked. Broken things deserve another chance." Her eyes met his, unwavering. "Not everything is material. Not everything is replaceable with wealth, with influence, or with time alone. People, moments, relationships, they can be broken, neglected, misunderstood, and yet they can still be restored. They can still matter. They can still grow if someone chooses to see value where others only see damage." Aurelian felt a shiver of recognition run through him. She was speaking to him as much as about him, about the life he had led, the people he had dismissed, the opportunities for connection he had ignored in the pursuit of perfection and power. "I've been thinking," she continued, voice calm but insistent, "how many things we throw away simply because they aren't convenient, because they're messy, because they don't fit the ideal we've constructed in our minds. How many lives, experiences, and chances we discard before giving them a moment of attention." Her words were deliberate, unhurried, yet every syllable carried weight. Aurelian felt the edges of his heart, long armored and carefully measured, soften under the impact. The phrase, "broken things deserve another chance," was no longer abstract. It was a lens through which he could examine his own decisions, his treatment of others, and the emotional walls he had erected around himself. "You mean," he began cautiously, "that it's not just objects or minor mistakes you're talking about. It's people?" She nodded. "People are the hardest to fix because they are alive, unpredictable, and carry histories we often don't understand. But just because something is damaged, flawed, or overlooked, it doesn't mean it's beyond care or restoration. That's what makes choosing to see and act so important." He sank into the bench, absorbing the lesson. Her words were not a rebuke, but a revelation. They demanded reflection, courage, and humility. He realized, for the first time in decades, that some of the individuals he had discarded, employees, friends, partners, might have needed patience, attention, and recognition rather than dismissal or judgment. Her gaze softened, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging the weight of her lesson on him. Every time you decide to notice, to repair, to restore, you honor not just the person or thing but yourself. You grow in ways no achievement or acquisition can replicate. Aurelian felt an unfamiliar clarity. Wealth had given him power, influence, and comfort. Thessaly's perspective gave him insight, responsibility, and the potential for meaningful connection. The difference was profound, quiet, and transformative. Aurelian leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his mind racing. Thessaly's words reverberated through him, unearthing thoughts he had long suppressed. He thought about the people he had dismissed, overlooked, or deemed unworthy because they didn't fit the precise mold he had constructed for success. There had been employees whose ideas he had ignored, friends he had abandoned when their lives became inconvenient, and partnerships he had ended abruptly when outcomes didn't align perfectly. He had always justified these actions with efficiency, pragmatism, or strategic reasoning, but now, through the lens Thessaly offered, he could see a harsher truth. Each memory arrived with clarity. A promising assistant he had dismissed for speaking candidly, a colleague whose innovative project he had shut down for being messy, friends whose presence he had allowed to fade because he was too absorbed in control. In every case, he had acted as if perfection were the only acceptable standard, as if brokenness were a flaw beyond redemption. And yet, Thessaly's words pierced that armor. Broken things deserve another chance. He imagined these people, not as failures, but as individuals with potential, resilience, and value he had refused to recognize. The realization weighed heavily on him. Wealth had built empires, humility built understanding, control had maintained order, awareness nurtured growth. He had been blind to the latter, fixated on the former. "I've discarded too much," he murmured to himself, almost as if confessing aloud could absolve some of the guilt. "Too many people, opportunities, moments." Thessaly's gaze, steady and unwavering, met his. "Acknowledgement is the first step, Aurelian. Recognition alone is not enough, but it is necessary. Once you see what was overlooked, you can decide what to do with that knowledge. You can choose to restore, to repair, to honor what was discarded, or you can ignore it again. The choice is yours." He exhaled, feeling a mix of shame, clarity, and awakening. It was a rare combination, the kind that comes when comfort is disrupted by insight, when a perspective penetrates walls built over decades. Aurelian thought of his empire, meticulously organized, efficient, and powerful. And then he thought of the lives outside its walls, fragile, messy, imperfect, yet filled with dignity, courage, and hope. How many of those lives had he dismissed because they didn't align with his expectations, because he valued perfection over persistence? Her words had not merely shifted his thinking, they had forced a reckoning. He realized that repair was not limited to objects or fleeting mistakes. It applied to human connections, to the unseen consequences of his actions, to moments he had allowed to pass without engagement. The lesson was simple yet profound. Noticing alone was insufficient. Choice, attention, and effort were required. And now that he saw what he had neglected, he could no longer pretend it didn't matter. Aurelian sat in the quiet of his office later that evening, the city outside glowing faintly beneath a veil of twilight. He held the memory of Thessaly's words like a fragile artifact, turning them over in his mind, examining their weight, their resonance. Broken things deserve another chance. The phrase repeated itself silently, not as a mantra, but as a question directed inward. What had he overlooked? What had he cast aside in pursuit of perfection, control, and success? How many lives, moments, and opportunities had he allowed to slip through his fingers because they were inconvenient, messy, or imperfect? He thought about employees, friends, and acquaintances, people whose potential he had dismissed, whose voices he had ignored, whose needs he had deemed secondary to his ambition. And now, he recognized the gravity of what he had discarded. It was a stark, humbling realization. Yet alongside the weight of regret came a spark of possibility. Recognition alone was insufficient. He needed action. Awareness, he understood, was only valuable if it led to change, if it transformed his interactions, his decisions, and his willingness to invest in what truly mattered. He closed his eyes and pictured the countless small acts Thessaly had described, repairing a toy for a child, acknowledging another's presence, seeing value in what others ignored. It wasn't about grand gestures or accolades. It was about intentionality, attention, and a commitment to restoration. Aurelian opened his eyes, the city lights reflecting in them. He realized that he could not undo the past, but he could approach the future differently. He could notice more carefully, act with humility, and honor what he had previously discarded. He could see potential where others saw flaws, and perhaps in doing so, discover a depth of connection that money, power, and control had never provided. Her resilience, her clarity, her insistence on hope amidst loss, all of it illuminated a path he had never consciously considered, and he felt an unfamiliar but welcome sensation, responsibility, not for accumulation or prestige, but for understanding, repairing, and nurturing. Aurelian reached for a notebook on his desk, fingers tracing the edges as he reflected. For the first time in years, he began to jot down thoughts not related to profits, acquisitions, or strategy. Instead, he wrote reminders to observe, to listen, to engage, to restore. A subtle shift had occurred. The lesson Thessaly had imparted was no longer external. It had taken residence within him. He thought of her line again. Broken things deserve another chance. And for the first time he understood that the sentiment applied not only to objects or fleeting mistakes, but to people, to the discarded, the overlooked, the underestimated, and most importantly, to himself. As night deepened outside, Aurelian felt a quiet determination. He would not let her lesson remain abstract or fleeting. He would carry it forward, consciously, deliberately, allowing it to influence his choices, his connections, and the way he viewed the world. If this story is already moving you, tap like. It helps others discover stories that inspire change. And with that, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, unhurried and deeply intentional, as the first seeds of transformation began to take root. The morning was overcast, with the faint scent of rain lingering in the city. Aurelian drove past familiar corporate towers, but today he wasn't headed toward boardrooms or meetings. Instead, he found himself at the entrance of the small community shelter where Thessaly often volunteered. He paused briefly at the doorway, adjusting his tie and taking in the sight of the worn building. Children's laughter echoed faintly from inside, mixing with the gentle hum of conversation and clattering dishes. Aurelian felt a nervous anticipation, realizing that this visit wasn't about authority or control. It was about observation, listening, and understanding. As he stepped inside, Thessaly noticed him immediately. She approached, her expression calm, welcoming, but cautious, a subtle reminder that he was entering her world, not imposing his. "You came," she said simply. "I did," he replied, his voice quieter than usual, stripped of its usual assertiveness. "I want to see, listen, understand." She nodded, as if approving the intention, then gestured toward the activities around them. Children were crafting, a few volunteers were preparing meals, and others were quietly engaged in tutoring. Aurelian followed her lead, walking slowly among the tables, observing without intrusion. It was a strange sensation for him, to exist in a space without influence or hierarchy. Here, titles and wealth meant nothing. Only presence, attention, and care mattered. He realized immediately that this was the lesson Thessaly had been preparing him for. Generosity was not transactional. It wasn't about money, status, or recognition. It was about showing up, noticing, and being present. He paused near a table where a child struggled to fix a small wooden toy. Without thinking of impressing anyone, he knelt beside the child, offering a hand and a quiet word of encouragement. The child's eyes lit up, a mixture of pride and curiosity. It was a simple act, but Aurelian felt its weight ripple through him. Thessaly observed from a short distance, her expression unreadable but approving. She didn't intervene, she allowed him the space to discover, to learn through action rather than instruction. For hours, Aurelian moved among the shelter's occupants, assisting quietly, observing gestures of patience, resilience, and care. Each interaction revealed new layers of life he had previously ignored, stories of courage, loss, hope, and persistence. He began to see the depth in small acts, the dignity in struggle, and the profound impact of genuine attention. By mid-afternoon, he realized that he had spent more time listening than speaking, more time observing than acting. And yet, it felt more meaningful than any decision he had made in a corporate setting. Here, the rhythm of life was not dictated by profit margins or market projections, but by presence, empathy, and attentiveness. Aurelian spent the morning quietly moving through the shelter, assisting wherever he could. He carried trays of food, organized supplies, and helped children tie shoelaces or repair broken toys, but he did so without any expectation of acknowledgement. Each task, no matter how small, felt unexpectedly profound. He watched Thessaly guide a young girl through repairing a simple radio. The girl's hands trembled as she twisted screws and aligned wires, her determination unwavering despite repeated mistakes. Thessaly's presence was calm, her instructions measured, allowing the child to discover solutions rather than handing them answers. Aurelian knelt nearby, observing the interaction. He marveled at how patience, simple, consistent, human attention could cultivate confidence, curiosity, and joy in ways money never could. He realized that in his world, he had often equated guidance with authority, overlooking the quiet power of mentorship rooted in understanding and presence. When a boy dropped a model airplane he had been repairing, Aurelian instinctively picked it up and handed it back. The boy's eyes widened with gratitude, and in that brief moment, Aurelian understood something he had never felt before. Generosity is not about currency, it is about care. It is in the small gestures, the acknowledgement of effort, the willingness to be present without expectation, that true impact occurs. Thessaly caught his eye across the room. She didn't speak, but her subtle nod said more than words could convey. He was beginning to see, not just intellectually but emotionally, the difference between giving out of obligation and giving through genuine connection. Throughout the day, Aurelian continued to engage quietly, stepping aside when necessary to allow others to lead, listening more than speaking, and observing life from the ground rather than from a perch of control. He watched volunteers navigate the challenges of the shelter with patience, creativity, and humor. He noticed the bonds forming among children who, despite their circumstances, shared laughter, trust, and collaboration. For the first time, he understood the profound value of being present. He saw how attention could heal invisible wounds, how recognition could empower the overlooked, and how simple, consistent acts of care could restore dignity. These were lessons his wealth could never teach, strategies his boardrooms could never offer. By late afternoon, Aurelian felt a shift within himself. The constant drive for control and perfection, the obsession with outcomes and efficiency seemed trivial compared to the simple, transformative power of presence, patience, and genuine engagement. He realized that the world he had built, polished, precise, controlled, was only a fragment of life's depth. True richness lay in the moments where effort met empathy, action intersected with understanding, and attention created meaning. As the afternoon light shifted, Aurelian paused by a small corner where children had gathered to repair a makeshift puzzle. He knelt beside them, offering encouragement and gentle guidance, yet deliberately refraining from directing the process. He allowed the children to experiment, make mistakes, and find solutions on their own. Watching them, he felt a revelation take root. For years, he had equated generosity with currency, assuming that giving money, donating resources, or funding projects were sufficient to make a difference. But here, in the humble shelter, he was learning that true generosity carried no ledger, no expectation, no return on investment. It was measured in presence, attention, and the willingness to engage with care and intention. Thessaly noticed his reflection and smiled subtly. She approached him, kneeling for a brief moment to align the puzzle pieces with the children. "You see it now, don't you?" she asked softly, her voice unhurried. "I do," he admitted, the words almost foreign to his usual vocabulary. "It's not about what I can give in terms of money. It's about showing up, noticing, being present." She nodded, her eyes reflecting a quiet satisfaction. "Every moment you choose to engage, every small act of acknowledgement is a seed. It grows, it restores. It matters far more than any donation." Aurelian reflected on the countless decisions in his life where he had substituted presence with currency, substituting care with convenience. Deals closed, donations written, programs funded. Yet so much of it had lacked intentionality, observation, and personal connection. And here, in this modest space, he was discovering the depth of impact that could come from simple attention and effort. Throughout the day, he continued to help wherever he could, observing patterns of resilience and cooperation that thrived not because of money, but because of consistent care, encouragement, and respect. He saw volunteers patiently guide children through challenges, offering words of affirmation, demonstrating patience, and celebrating progress. Every smile, every nod, every moment of acknowledgement carried significance far beyond what he had imagined. By the late afternoon, Aurelian realized a fundamental truth. Wealth could create comfort, influence, and opportunity, but it could not cultivate connection, empathy, or understanding. Those qualities required intentionality, presence, and attention, gifts that cost nothing yet yielded immeasurable impact. He watched Thessaly quietly teaching a child to repair a torn notebook. The child's eyes sparkled with pride at the accomplishment, and Aurelian felt an unexpected warmth ripple through him. This was the essence of generosity, not measured in material value, but in human presence, in recognition, in the willingness to witness and nurture growth. For the first time in years, Aurelian felt the satisfaction of giving that could not be quantified, a fulfillment that no acquisition or transaction had ever provided. Generosity, he realized, was not an obligation, it was a choice, an intentional act of engagement with the world that honored both the giver and the recipient. As the afternoon wore on, Aurelian remained at the shelter, quietly assisting, observing, and listening. Every interaction, every small success among the children and volunteers began to ignite a new awareness within him. He realized that what he wanted, what he truly craved, was not more power, profit, or control, but the ability to create impact in a way that honored human resilience, dignity, and growth. He thought back to his empire, the structures he had built, the systems he had perfected. They were impressive, efficient, and influential, yet they had never felt alive in the way the shelter's simple routines did. Here, effort and attention produced immediate, visible results. Here, care was transformative. Here, restoration was possible. Aurelian glanced at Thessaly as she helped a child secure a loose hinge on a small wooden box. Her hands moved deftly, her patience unhurried, yet her influence was profound. In that moment, he understood the path he wanted to pursue, not a project designed for accolades or recognition, but a mission aimed at repairing what life had neglected, restoring what had been overlooked, and nurturing potential where others saw loss or imperfection. It wasn't a plan yet, not fully. It was a seed, a spark of purpose rooted in presence and human connection. He envisioned programs, opportunities, and safe spaces where children and adults alike could find guidance, encouragement, and restoration. Profit was secondary. Impact was primary. The ambition that had once driven him now had a new direction: to build systems that repaired lives, rather than just numbers or bottom lines. He thought of the countless people he had dismissed in his corporate life, employees whose talents had been overlooked, ideas that had been discarded, individuals whose potential had been minimized. He realized that he now had the tools, perspective, and resources to address that oversight, to create something lasting, meaningful, and restorative. Thessaly approached him, carrying a stack of repaired items she had organized throughout the day. She glanced at him quietly, then said, "It seems you're learning something more than instructions and tasks. You're seeing possibilities, not just needs." He nodded, a soft smile forming. "Yes, possibilities. Not just for them, but for me as well. I've spent so long managing outcomes, controlling results, and striving for perfection. Now I see that influence is meaningful only when it restores, when it nurtures, when it creates growth where there was none." Her eyes reflected a quiet satisfaction, and for the first time, Aurelian felt aligned with someone else's values without compromise. The lesson she had imparted in the rain, that broken things deserve another chance, was no longer abstract. It had transformed into actionable insight, guiding his thoughts, intentions, and emerging purpose. By the end of the day, Aurelian walked home with a sense of quiet determination. The vision he carried was nascent but tangible, like a blueprint forming in the back of his mind. He wasn't yet certain how he would execute it, what shape it would take, or what challenges lay ahead. But he knew, with clarity he hadn't experienced in years, that his focus would shift from accumulation to restoration, from control to care, from perfection to presence. As evening approached, the shelter began to quiet. Volunteers tidied tables, children finished their activities, and the faint hum of the city outside became more pronounced against the peaceful interior. Aurelian lingered, unwilling to leave the place so rich with lessons and quiet inspiration. He reflected on the day's experiences, the smiles of the children, the laughter that filled spaces once dominated by struggle, the careful patience of volunteers, and Thessaly's steadfast presence. Each moment was a testament to what he had long overlooked: the transformative power of attention, encouragement, and consistent care. For the first time in decades, he felt the difference between giving and truly contributing. It wasn't the act of donation that held weight. It was the choice to be fully present, to engage without expectation, to honor the dignity of those around him. Every small action today had created ripple effects, fostering confidence, hope, and growth in ways his wealth could never replicate. Thessaly approached him, holding a repaired toy in her hands. "You've learned more than you realize today," she said softly. "Being present, noticing needs, nurturing growth, that's where true impact lies. Wealth can provide tools, but it cannot replace intention, care, and connection." He nodded, deeply aware of how her words mirrored the realization forming within him. The day had shifted something fundamental. He was no longer merely a spectator in the lives of others. He had begun to participate, to understand, and to contribute meaningfully. Aurelian's mind wandered to the future. He envisioned projects that could combine resources and intentional action, creating spaces and opportunities where brokenness could be acknowledged, addressed, and transformed. He imagined children learning skills not just for survival, but for growth, confidence, and self-worth. He imagined adults finding support and guidance in ways that empowered them rather than offering temporary relief. And beneath it all, he recognized that these initiatives, born from observation and understanding, would be built not from ambition alone, but from the principle Thessaly had demonstrated time and again: broken things deserve another chance. He glanced at her, gratitude silent but profound. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything you've shown me. Today mattered more than any deal I've closed or achievement I've earned." Thessaly smiled, her eyes reflecting a quiet acknowledgement. "It only matters if you carry it forward. The choice is yours," Aurelian understood. The lesson was not complete with observation alone. Action, intentionality, and follow-through would define the depth of his transformation. If this story moves you, share it. You never know who needs a reminder that kindness can rebuild anything. As he stepped outside, the city stretched before him in muted twilight. The buildings, streets, and distant lights reminded him of the world he had once dominated from above, now seen with a new perspective. He felt a growing sense of purpose, a quiet determination to bridge the gap between influence and impact, to channel his resources toward restoring, nurturing, and empowering. For the first time in a long while, Aurelian's actions were aligned with insight. The seeds of change had been planted, and he felt them taking root. Subtle, steady, transformative. Aurelian walked the quiet streets after leaving the shelter, the evening settling over the city in muted hues. The day had been transformative, yet something lingered, an unsettled feeling born of incomplete understanding. He had observed, participated, and learned, but Thessaly, as always, remained slightly beyond reach. He glanced back toward the shelter one last time. She was gone. The volunteers and children moved about their routines, yet she was nowhere to be found. It was as if she had melted into the evening air, leaving only her lessons behind. Aurelian paused, a mix of admiration and longing stirring within him. Thessaly had returned fleetingly into his life, yet her impact was profound. He had been present physically, but she had shown him how to be present emotionally, mentally, spiritually. And now, with her absence, he felt the weight of what he had yet to understand. The streets were still, punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic. Aurelian walked slowly, aware of the emptiness her absence had created, yet grateful for the awareness she had instilled. It was both inspiring and unsettling, a reminder that growth often begins in spaces of uncertainty. As Aurelian reached the quiet corner of the street, he instinctively reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against something familiar, the cufflink. He pulled it out and examined it under the faint glow of a nearby street lamp. It was perfectly fixed. The bent clasp had been restored to its original alignment, precise and immaculate. Yet the memory of Thessaly's hands guiding the repair added depth to the object. It was more than metal. It was a symbol, a tangible reminder of the day's lessons. He turned it over in his palm slowly, reflecting on its significance. This cufflink, once broken, now restored, mirrored what had begun to shift within him. It was a quiet, potent reminder that attention, care, and effort, not wealth or control, held the power to mend what was fractured. The symbolism was unmistakable. Thessaly had fixed the cufflink, yes, but what she had truly repaired was something inside him, a part of him that had long been rigid, isolated, and closed off. She had shown him the value of patience, observation, and genuine presence. And though she was gone, her influence lingered palpably, leaving him unsettled yet inspired. Aurelian held the cufflink close, feeling its weight and meaning. It was no longer just an accessory. It had become a symbol of transformation, an emblem of the change he had begun to embrace. Aurelian turned the cufflink over and over in his hand, feeling a quiet reverence for the simplicity of its restoration. Yet he knew, with a deep and undeniable certainty, that Thessaly's impact extended far beyond a mere piece of jewelry. Her lesson, expressed in her words, in her quiet actions, and in the patience with which she approached the broken, had permeated him. He recognized, more clearly than ever, that what she had repaired was not metal or material, but a part of himself that had long been neglected, the part that believed connection could heal, that presence could empower, and that understanding could transform. For the first time, he saw his own brokenness, the walls he had erected, the trust he had withheld, the moments of oversight and dismissal he had imposed on others. Thessaly's simple phrase echoed in his mind. Broken things deserve another chance. It wasn't just an instruction for objects, children, or small tasks. It was a philosophy, a moral compass, a guiding principle for life itself. And it applied to him, too. He had been rigid, solitary, and insulated from the richness of shared human experience. Yet her quiet intervention had begun to shift that, piece by piece, like the meticulous correction of a bent clasp. Aurelian exhaled slowly, a mixture of awe, humility, and determination filling him. The cufflink in his hand was now more than a token, it was a mirror, reflecting the potential for restoration, both of the world around him and of himself. Aurelian walked slowly through the dimly lit streets, the cufflink still resting in his palm. The city stretched around him, familiar yet strangely different. Buildings he had once seen as monuments to power now seemed like silent witnesses to the shift occurring within him. He understood, with clarity, that Thessaly was not someone he needed to save or fix. She had her own strength, her own resilience, and her own path. But he knew he needed her presence, her guidance, and the lessons she carried. She was a teacher in action, a living embodiment of the principle that had begun reshaping his perspective. Broken things, people included, could be restored through attention, care, and understanding. Stopping beneath a quiet street lamp, he made a silent vow. He would find her again, not to offer money or protection, not to impose his influence, but to learn, to witness, and to grow alongside. Her world, though different from his, held truths he had never encountered, insights that no wealth or boardroom could provide. He closed his eyes briefly, imagining the next encounter, uncertain, perhaps challenging, but necessary. The humility he felt was unfamiliar but grounding. It was a stark contrast to the certainty he had carried all his life. For the first time, he approached the unknown, not with dominance or control, but with openness and intention. Aurelian opened his eyes and clenched the cufflink lightly in his hand, a token and a reminder of what had already begun to shift within him. The journey was far from over, and though Thessaly had disappeared into the night, her impact would guide him until they met again. Aurelian walked through the quiet city streets, the night air carrying a mixture of cool calm and restless anticipation. Thessaly had vanished once more, leaving him with nothing but the fixed cufflink and the echoes of her words. Yet those echoes were louder than any noise the city could offer. He understood now that her impact extended beyond a single interaction. She had shifted something fundamental within him, the way he perceived value, connection, and the potential for restoration. And though she was absent, her lessons would continue to guide his steps. The cufflink in his pocket gleamed faintly under the streetlight, a tangible reminder that transformation could begin in the smallest gestures. What she had repaired in him, attention, empathy, patience, and presence, was far more significant than any material object. It was the beginning of a journey, one that could reshape not only his life but the lives of others he touched along the way. Aurelian paused, taking a deep breath. He didn't yet know when or how he would see Thessaly again, but one thing was certain: he would find her, not to rescue her, not to alter her path, but to continue learning from her courage, resilience, and quiet wisdom. If you want to see how one act of kindness can transform a life, hit subscribe and stay tuned for part 3. With that, he continued walking into the night, the city around him both familiar and changed, reflecting the shift within. The story was far from over. This was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge, inspire, and reveal the true power of human connection.